Hello there and welcome back to Space Marine, where we are back with another guide video. So this time I thought I would go with something fairly topical, which is 1v1s or dueling, since there is of course the brand new 1v1 Heralds of Glory tournament upcoming at the end of this month. If you're interested in joining, or if you're inspired after watching this video, I will leave a link to join it in the description. I've had a fair few different people asking me for tips or advice on how exactly to play 1v1, so I thought why not make a video specifically aimed at those newer players who don't have the experience or the inside knowledge. Now it must be noted that I am by no means the best 1v1 player in this game, but I do think I have a fairly good understanding of the game mode itself, since I've done a fair bit of training and coaching for aspiring GKs, and of course the trial for GK is a series of 1v1s. So, in this video we're going to start off by looking at some general tips and advice on the game mode itself, which is in fact extremely different to a standard public match, after which we're going to have a look at some of the meta loadouts and also the playstyles that you'll be wanting to adopt with those, and then finish off by looking at some slightly spooky off-meta tactics that you might want to try. Now the number one tip, if you take anything away from this video, then I want it to be this: you're under absolutely no time pressure. The number of times that I see players who are new to 1v1s blundering in headlessly, just running around the map waiting to get themselves killed, it happens a lot, let's just say that much. The key to doing well here is setting up your engagements, learning where your opponent is, and then taking action that matches what they are trying to do. So, take your time, and if you have the option to disengage, do so the moment that you lose the advantage in an engagement. The result of this tends to mean that in high-level duels, you'll have extremely long, drawn-out fights, with one player gaining an advantage and the other one backing off and resetting the fight, and the fight will eventually be determined by the player who is best at pushing their advantage when they gain it. Certain classes and weapons are much better at this than others, but we will touch on that a bit later on. But first of all, you might ask, how on earth can you know where your opponent is? Most Space Marine maps are fairly well populated with obscuring terrain, so you will rarely have line of sight to a vast swathe of the map. The answer is sound cues. This is most obvious when it comes to assaults, who are of course very, very audible whenever they fire their jump packs, but the same applies to all classes simply with the movement of their feet. Footsteps are very, very loud in this game, particularly when sprinting, so you can usually hear your opponent unless they're right on the other side of the map. You can use this to track them and plan out an approach or an ambush. Another extremely important point to note about 1v1s is the presence of host advantage. Now of course this does exist in public matches, but with only 2 players in the game, it is vastly more noticeable in a 1v1 setting. In other words, the player who is hosting the game gets a significant advantage over the player who is not, which is why most tournaments will run a multi-round system, where one player hosts and then the other one follows up. To put the scale of this advantage into context, I would expect that if you were to clone me and put one against the other on each one's host and then on the other's host, then the score would probably be 20 to 12 and then 12 to 20. A very significant difference of 8 kills between 2 players exactly even in skill. So how can you use this knowledge to your advantage? Well, the most obvious answer to that is simply to not panic. If you start on your opponent's host and they are absolutely thrashing you, remember they have a significant advantage, so when it comes over to your host, you might well be able to return the favour. But of course, in an ideal world you wouldn't be looking to drop any maps at all, so how can we mitigate this advantage or at least play around it somewhat? Generally speaking, the most common effects of a lag advantage are more reliable explosive and AoE weapons such as grenades, ground pounds and melter guns, while being much harder to pin down and stun in melee, and also inflicting wall shots on your opponent with hit scan weapons. Meanwhile, the opposite of these effects tends to apply to the player who is not the host. So it's very important to be aware of not only which weapons of yours are likely to underperform, but also which weapons of theirs are likely to do a lot more damage than you would expect. So, when playing against hosts, it's usually advisable to avoid melee wherever possible and instead focus on your own hit scan weapons, while bearing in mind that you have less time to react to your opponent's shots. So with all that theory in mind, let's talk about some loadouts and put it into practice. But first of all, let's consider a word that I've already used and will be using considerably more, which is meta. In gaming terms, this simply stands for most effective tactics available. In other words, what's the best? What works? Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately depending on your outlook, the meta in 1v1s is actually quite rigid. Certainly more so than larger scale matches anyway. Now the main reason behind this is something that I've actually already mentioned, which is namely the ability to disengage from an unfavourable fight and the ability to push the advantage when you have it. This neatly divides the meta into two halves, one of which is based on mobility builds, the other of which is based on high durability and regen. Another very desirable trait is burst damage. In a game mode where so much is dependent on the ability to disengage and retreat, it's important to be able to confirm the kill, especially with no teammates to be able to finish it off. So, we'll start off by looking at one of the most popular builds in the game, which is a Lascannon Devastator. This is characterized by its use of Artificer armor to give it much needed regen, and the Lascannon itself, which is an absolutely fantastic weapon and easily the strongest in the game in my opinion. We'll cover the additional perk that you might want to take with it and the special equipment a bit later on when we talk about counters. As you've probably guessed, since it is based on the Devastator frame, this is not a build designed around mobility. Instead, it is a very defensive, very castle-y type of build. By its nature, this also means that the Devastator will have an extremely hard time chasing down kills and also disengaging from fights. But that's where the Lascannon comes in as an extremely strong burst weapon. It's effective at just about all ranges depending on how good you are with hipfire, while clever defensive positions and use of cover allows the user to make full use of Artificer armor to swiftly regen from any incoming damage. As in public matches, the effectiveness of the weapon is simply only limited by the user's skill. With such a high skill cap, almost anything is possible provided that you have the mechanics to actually land the shot. This makes it an extremely oppressive weapon to attack, even for assaults who will often have a hard time reaching the target without losing their armor at the very least. However, if an assault can close the gap, the Devastator will often be left rather vulnerable, which is where our second perk and special equipment choices can come in. Specifically, Feel No Pain and potentially Stims to double down on the close combat protection. With such high damage mitigation from melee attacks and explosives, an assault will have a hard time denting you. Against ground targets looking to engage in a more conventional firefight, Iron Halo is often the better pick. This is absolutely crucial in the mirror matchup against an enemy Lascannon who will otherwise be able to one-shot you. In this case, a frag grenade is usually the best pick as it can help to drive the enemy out of cover or relieve pressure on yourself if you're being pushed too hard. As I've already mentioned, this loadout very much lends itself to defensive play. Especially against assault marines, you will usually find yourself having to play with a ceiling over your head so that they will struggle to ground pound you. Without this, especially on an enemy host, you'll have a very, very hard time staying alive, even with Feel No Pain and Stims. As such, the real challenge to using this loadout lies not only with staying alive, but also confirming kills, since especially assault marines and other more mobile classes will have an easy time getting away when you've already inflicted some damage. Balancing survival with pushing out far enough to actually finish a target is a very important skill to master and one that will only come with experience. So let's move on to the counters of this particular class. There are none, it's that simple. Let's move on to the next. I'm joking of course, but the point remains that there isn't really a hard counter to this loadout at all, especially in its optimum state with Lascannon, Artificer armor and Iron Halo or Feel No Pain. There are however certain soft counters that can be effective, particularly the Thunder Hammer on a friendly host, although you'll very much struggle to land solid hits on an enemy host. Under certain circumstances, an explosive-based tactical build with Vengeance Launcher can be effective, although by and large, the Lascannon loadout can be considered to effectively hard counter the entire tactical class simply by being able to one-shot it at almost any range unless the tactical is using Stims. There is of course a lot more I could say about the nuances of Lascannon dueling, but this is a basic introductory guide, so let's move on to the next build, which is the fast mobility one. If you haven't guessed that this relies on the assault class, then click off the video now, you're beyond help. For those of you who are still here, let's talk a bit more about what makes this class so effective and the options that you will want to choose with it. For this class, the only really mandatory feature is the Impenetrable perk. The rest is somewhat open to interpretation, although by far the most popular choices are the Power Sword and the Bolt Pistol. Reason being that if you are using melee, it will mostly be to finish off a wounded target, and because the Bolt Pistol is very capable of dealing burst damage in its own right. It is my opinion that it would actually be a worthy primary weapon, let alone a sidearm. And in fact, in dueling circumstances, the Bolt Pistol is very much the primary weapon of this build. The most popular choices for the second perk are usually either Death from Above or Furious Charge. These are both extremely viable options, and we'll talk a bit more about the circumstances you might wish to use each one a bit later on. But first, let's consider the sort of playstyle you should be wishing to adopt when using these weapons. Contrary to popular belief, this is not a rush build, this is a skirmish build. Against ground classes, you should be looking to deal poke damage to the target, and then retreat when you take significant damage in return. The only time to commit is when you have a significant advantage in terms of health. This playstyle by far makes the best use of the assault's natural attributes, which are speed and the ability to move in vertical directions. Functionally, this gives you endless attempts to gain an advantage and a very effective means of following up on it. You poke with your pistol, if you take too much damage in return, you simply retreat, wait for your armor to regen, and try again. In contrast, a ground class simply cannot afford to lose that advantage because the assault has the mobility necessary to push up and capitalize. It's simply impossible to overstate the importance of being able to pick and choose which engagements you commit to, and the ground class simply cannot do that. Against an enemy assault marine, the same concept mostly applies. Both sides are poking to gain an advantage and then trying to follow up on it. However, you have to be especially careful where you jump as an assault against another assault, because getting ground pounded by the enemy is simply suicide. In other words, don't jump first, or at least don't jump first in a position where you can be ground pounded. As with all effective 1v1 loadouts, patience is the key. Plan your engagements, only take the ones you think you can win, and make sure you have the advantage before you fully commit. In terms of counters, Assault is very effective against most ground classes simply because of that advantage in being able to engage and disengage. The exception is the las cannon build we discussed previously, which actually has a very even matchup against this loadout. With two experienced players at the helm, it turns into a lethal game of cat and mouse with no clear advantage held by either side. In terms of counters to this build, the only real counter available is Vengeance Launcher. This is because it deals explosive damage which offsets the impenetrable perk and also can target the assault in midair very easily with its explosive splash damage. Plus it's able to target the assault around corners when he might be taking cover or seeking to regen. You might be thinking that the melter gun is another effective tactic against assaults as it tends to be in public matches, but that's really not the case here. As I've mentioned, skilled assaults will usually be skirmishing rather than committing, and the melter gun simply has no answer to that since mid-range is the assault's speciality with this build. There are certainly other mid-range options that outgun the bolt pistol, but as I've mentioned, with endless attempts to disengage and re-engage, that really doesn't matter too much for this matchup. A lot of assault players also maintain a variety of secondary perks for their loadouts, the most common as I've mentioned being Furious Charge, Death from Above, but also air-cooled thrusters. Furious Charge combos excellently with combat stims for a cheeky one-shot kill on an enemy tactical or an enemy assault, while actually providing burst damage to burn straight through the Devastator's Iron Halo and possibly even feel no pain. Death from Above is an excellent tool for punishing people who stray too far away from the ceilings, particularly on your own host where it's very difficult for your opponent to avoid the damage. This is also a very popular choice for the Assault Mirror matchup where you can really punish an enemy who jumps in too soon. Finally, air-cooled thrusters is a good pick for the dedicated shooty assault as it gives the highest mobility at the expense of melee burst damage. Once again, I could speak endlessly about the nuances of assault play in duels, but I'm not going to. Instead, we're going to wrap it up by talking about some off-meta choices and when you might want to field them. What? I hear you ask. That's it? There are only 2 meta classes for duels? Yeah, basically. I don't know, the game's kinda silly, honestly. It's not very well designed for 1v1s. Which leads us on to the question of what to do if you're not confident on either of those particular loadouts. The obvious answer is to learn one or the other. They're both equally viable since neither particularly counters the other and both can be very effective against just about anything else in the game. However, the alternative option is to simply force through your specialist loadout and play against a disadvantage. Anyone who's watched this channel in the past will know that I am a tactical specialist, which is in fact the worst class for dueling by a significant margin, and the weapons of choice for dueling are far from optimal even at that. So if you find yourself in a similar situation, it really is something of a judgment call. You have to decide if you'll be more effective with the meta loadout, which you may be uncomfortable with, or if you simply want to play at the disadvantage and rely on your own individual skill to equal it out. This is very variable depending on what your opponent is playing. For example, on tactical, it might be possible for me to fight an assault, however against a las cannon that would prove to be very difficult indeed, so I would most likely have to switch to a las cannon of my own, since that's my next most comfortable meta pick. The alternative is to go for something off-meta, but something that counters what your opponent is playing at that moment in time, for example the Thunderhammer. However, there's certain risk to this tactic. Remember, each time you do manage to kill an opponent with that hard countering weapon, they get the option to switch as well, and if they're already up in points then you'll end up in an endless cycle of both players switching and trading kills, which you'll eventually lose. This is the fundamental reason why there are only really 2 meta loadouts. Both of them have a vast majority of favourable matchups, and neither of them have any particular hard counters. This means that no matter what your opponent switches to, you're always in with at least a fighting chance. And you'll be able to gather some momentum, which is extremely important for morale purposes. Which brings us on to the final thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is the mental side of the game. Duels are by far the most mentally fatiguing game mode in the entirety of Space Marine. And regardless of how it's going, there's no respite to be had. You simply keep going and going and going until one side reaches 20. It's easy to get demoralized and simply want to give up, but don't do that. The most important thing that you can possibly do is keep fighting. Your opponent is human too, and especially in 1v1s, if you can string together some kills, the pressure will really start to mount, regardless of how far ahead they are. There's no avoiding the mental strain, the only real solution is practice. So treat it as practice, even if you're getting hammered, think of it as a learning experience. And on the subject of learning experiences, I've decided to do something a little bit different with the videos from the upcoming tournament that will be uploaded to this channel. In each round I will be live narrating my decision-making processes and thoughts throughout each battle. I've never actually tried live commentary for when I'm playing, so it's going to be equally interesting to see how it goes for me, and knowing me, I've just jinxed myself and I will crash out after the first round and there'll be absolutely nothing of value to be learned. But, on the off chance that that doesn't happen, stick around, maybe drop a sub. If you're interested in seeing a bit more 1v1 content, then stay tuned for the coming weeks. In the meantime, best of luck with your own matches in the tournament, and as always, I will see you on the battlefield.